Good morning and welcome to another LinkedIn and Facebook Live. I've got another very special guest. It's Cate Bakos from Cate Bakos Property in Melbourne. Thanks for joining us, Cate.
Always a pleasure, Mike. Today you get me from the sunny studios of the Bakos dining room.
It looks so sunny that you're sponsored by Kathmandu. We can do product placement. I'm not getting any money for that, but if you want to reach out, it's freezing where I am as well. Now, the first question is, I think, for any Melburnian is how are you?
Doing okay. We've just finished 2 weeks of hard lockdown. So today is day one of a very, very restricted finish of lockdown, and the reality is it's not all that different. We're not allowed to have friends to our homes, and we're not allowed to go to anyone else's place, and if you can manage to get a cafe or restaurant booking, you're doing well. We've got a long weekend and it does feel a little bit sad and a little bit wasted. I think all of the money that was set to go to the regions has been put on hold this weekend. So hopefully they get a grip on these case numbers and ease our restrictions for us, because life in Melbourne in a cold, wintry time of year is not particularly nice when you're in lockdown as well.
No, of course. And honestly, I think people outside of Melbourne take a lot of things for granted now. I mean, I was in the Gold Coast and Brisbane a week or so ago, and the first question was, "You didn't come from Melbourne, did you?" It's just like it's almost like another country, and people are very wary. And you guys have, had a lot of time in these restrictions, which begs the question, like, what can you do as a buyer's agent? Can you transact on property? Are there auctions happening? Can you give us a bit of an update on Melbourne?
Yes, of course. For the last 2 weeks, we couldn't inspect properties to purchase. We've just been facilitating any transactions and negotiations, and in particular auctions online. So we were all pretty down with Zoom auctions. We could inspect properties for final inspection. Sorry, enter the cat.
We're used to that.
Yeah. So finals were permitted. We had a travel restriction on us, though. We initially couldn't go further than 5Ks, and then it was extended to 10. Real estate agents can perform the duties that they're required to, and if it's a contractual obligation, such as a final inspection, that was the only real freedom and need for getting in my car that I had. Outside of that, obviously, buying sight unseen is not something that we practice. So if we've been familiar with the property, we'd managed to see through it before lockdown commenced and we decided to go for it, then it was all about reverting to Zoom. That's how life has been for the last couple of weeks.
It's just absolutely crazy. And I guess it's been a mad rush to get things done on the properties that you have seen and inspected, and then hopefully a relaxation so you can get back to business. We've got a shout out from Michael Ossett, Sydney's Northern Beaches premier buyer's agent. Stick around, Michael, if you are here for a bit, because we are going to talk about Palm Beach, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on it. So if you can. Now, Cate, I want to talk to you about the Melbourne property market, because CoreLogic, of course, have come out with the May figures, and there's been some interesting things which I'll try and put up on the screen. Bear with me a second. Here we go. It looks as though Melbourne is sort of seeing a bit of a slowdown. We're not getting the results that Sydney is, for example. So, the past 12 months, looking at the change in dwelling values, only up 0.7%. The past month up 2.4, but compared to the past 3 months in Sydney, there's a big gap. And the past 12 months, it seems like Sydney has really slowed down there. But there's a couple of things that you have sort of educated me on that I think everyone that is looking at this sort of data really needs to understand. Can you help us out with that?
Yeah, of course. I love this chart. It's just full of issues and it really does illustrate the weaknesses of recording data. And let's go through it. Melbourne is a really great case study for several reasons. First and foremost, our past 12 months performance looks pretty dismal if we focus on 0.7%. Now, we were in a freezer, literally doing nothing, no transactions at all, for about 1/3 of the past 12 months. But when we also factor in data lag, so the delay between what we see happening on the ground and then what's recorded in this chart, that plays a huge role. And if data isn't reported immediately after a sale, and in a lot of cases data isn't, it's not until it settles and goes through the Valuer General's office and then the SRO, and it's recorded. So we're looking at a snapshot that is titled June, but we're most likely still looking at March, April. And when we overlay the fact that Melbourne wasn't trading at all 12 months ago, we really have to remember that 0.7%, when we wind the clock forward and take another poll of this in 4 or 5 months' time, that will look very different, because it will capture the crazy pace that we enjoyed in Melbourne once our gates opened in early November last year. And what I know at the coalface is for houses. So if we separate units and houses, we've absolutely smashed 10%. We're probably at around 15%. And I'm sure my industry buddies would agree. Melbourne has really performed well. Well, it's been a very difficult market for buyers and buyers agents. And I've talked to my Sydney buddies, and Sydney has gone crazy. But I don't feel that Melbourne's been a far weaker performer by any means. We've had a really vibrant market as well. Yep. Now, the interesting thing about this data is when we came out of COVID, the Victorian state government had a few initiatives and ideas to stimulate the market and to increase spending and consumer sentiment and obviously to contribute to the wealth effect. That's my theory. And one of the key things that they did was put forward a stamp duty concession for every single purchaser who was purchasing residential property, whether they were investors, first home buyers, retirees, it didn't matter. If it was under $1 million, the offering was 25% off the stamp duty for an established property and 50% off for a brand new property. And that was valid until the 30th of June. So we've still got a couple of weeks of that to run. And as you can imagine, when you put an offering like that out there, people do respond. And so we've had a huge run for properties that have been priced up to $1 million. And as a result, there's a disproportionate number of sales in that block. And it's an interesting thing what government incentives can do, because it can skew data. We've all of a sudden got an overrepresentation of sales in that sub-$1 million mark. It doesn't mean that property values haven't increased. It just means that the median price, the average of that is showing a lower figure. So data can tell you a lot, but if you don't question it, sometimes that can be lost, because Melbourne certainly has pushed forward and really surged. Any buyer at the coalface will tell you that. And particularly in that sub-$1 million market, we've seen all of the eligible buyers really pushing each other hard to make sure that they've been able to claim that concession.
Yeah. Now, that sort of strikes me as an unusual decision to make. I mean, obviously, the incentives for brand new. Yeah, I know, and there've been a few clangers in the last little while. But of course, stimulating the economy through construction and new property. There are risks for buyers out there, because new property is often where some spruikers tend to hide. But of course, construction's a big employer, so that kind of makes sense. But you're saying that this is not a first home buyer initiative. It's anybody. So really, it's maybe giving first homeowners a bit of a leg up, because it's at under $1 million mark. But if it's open for everybody, you're creating competition for them at the same time. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. I have attended many auctions where the appraised value was circa $950 to $980, and you can have 20 bidders in a crowd, and it's the person that says $1,000,001 that gets the keys. Yeah,
and I think you've raised some amazingly clever points about the veracity of that data. I mean, first we've got houses and units lumped together, and we're about to do a bit of a deep dive on the units. But of course, when you look at it on face value, you think, oh, Melbourne's quiet, and then I speak to some people like yourself, and you're like, oh my gosh, it's flat out, the market's crazy. And you're like, something going on there. So thanks for sort of sharing that with us. I want to go to now. This is almost like by accident a Melbourne story. We have a rental loss index, which we publish monthly, and I'm going to try and add that to the screen. Look at me go. Here we go. Here we go. So this is, for anyone that hasn't seen our rental loss index before, this is the sum of all vacant properties and what they're losing based on the median rent per type each month. So the reason why Melbourne is leading or losing the most, I guess, is because there's a huge amount of rental properties available there that are sitting vacant. And of course, we know that the vacancy rate for Melbourne CBD apartments is terrible. But what can you tell us about this?
This is very, very sad, and it's mostly a story of universities. And it's an eye-watering amount, really, Mike, to look at Melbourne losses. It's staggering. So we've always had a very large number of international students in our city, and they've really propped up the education sector. Obviously, we're not accommodating them at the moment. We've got a lot of vacant properties. Now, combine that with the fact that we've got an oversupply of high-rise in our city, in particular, in locations like South Bank and South Yarra. There's no surprises there that we've got some staggering rental losses showing up. Now, if we really focus on the big ones that are outside of that South Bank, South Yarra comment that I made, so Melbourne City itself, we had a city that was, zombie apocalyptic at one stage, and it's still quite vacant in terms of the number of students and residents living in apartments in the city. Carlton is our university precinct for mainly Melbourne Uni, but a lot of RMIT students will live around there as well. And then we go down to number 5, Hawthorn, we've got Swinburne University. Go down to number 6, Clayton, that's Monash University. Go down to number 9, Malvern East, and that is the Caulfield campus for Monash. So every time you've said to me, hey, this is a bit random, what's the go here? I've generally, hovered around universities and international students as the main reason for these horrendous vacancies.
Yep. And for anyone petrified that Sydney's gone into Victoria and into lockdown, that is an administrative cock-up, for which I apologise. Now, the next thing is, these are the top losses, and of course, if there's a huge proportion of available rentals, then that's why we're seeing those big numbers. But $3.3 million a month in rental losses is very, very painful for any landlords that own an investment property there. This particular one, I might sort of zoom in a little bit. This is where we're looking at the average loss per property, so per investor. So it's allowing for the fact that some places have a lower density than others. And Caulfield East, the average property investor is losing $717 a month. So you mentioned Caulfield East is that university precinct. So what we seem to have in common is that I guess the exodus of international students has really whacked the local rental market in those areas. Is there anything more to it?
No, that's a really good suggestion. And Caulfield East is a very tiny little segment of Caulfield. We've got Caulfield itself, Caulfield South, Caulfield North, and Caulfield East. But that is absolutely where the campus is. And if we go down to Box Hill, again, that's a really difficult average loss per property. Now, Box Hill is a really vibrant, dynamic part of Melbourne's Middle Ring East that has been very attractive for Chinese new arrivals. So there's a community there, a great marketplace. You can go into the plaza at Box Hill and struggle to see English signage and pricing. It's very, very Chinese centric, and clearly we've had a change in the number of foreign visitors and new arrivals. So that's a reason why Box Hill is really struggling. Burwood is Deakin University, the Burwood campus. It's a large uni hub. Again, we've got Carlton, Malvern East. So yeah, it's aside from Box Hill, that's a story of, again, student accommodation.
There's an interesting question from Kieran Clare, who is Australia's premier property journalist. It's an interesting one. Is it the time to buy a unit in these locations when, as early as this morning, they're talking about bringing students back in groups of 500 every fortnight to try and sort of save the university sector, I guess, with overseas students?
It's a very good question. I've thought about this myself, Kieran. I think there's two parts to this. If you're targeting a university precinct that is set to recover, that could be a really good move, because if you can bankroll it while it's still, we're not accepting or getting the numbers that we need, if you can afford to hold that, then it could be lucrative. But I would query the type of dwelling, and I think it's really important for us to focus on how our values and preferences and demand has changed for particular dwelling types. And what COVID has done is adjusted preferences across the board. And there are some of those preferences that will bounce back, because there's always a degree of elasticity to some of these decisions that we make when we're hating the situation that we're in. But there's some that will be lasting. And I think that the lasting impacts of COVID are likely to be the work from home phenomenon, and the ability to both, pivot and set up and work professionally without your bed in the background of your Zoom, or without over talking each other and having to be out on the porch on the phone. And so I've seen an enormous change in people's preferences, particularly for a genuine enclosed study area and the ability for two people to work remotely at any stage. And we're seeing workplaces are adjusting to a hybrid kind of arrangement. I think a lot of that is here to stay. I mean, we talk about the exodus from the city, and a fair few people did decide to buy further out or to move, and that has to be sustainable for lots of those people. So I'd argue that buying a one-bedder that's highly discounted is still not a great move. I think you've got to really be focusing on what could be a crowd-pleasing configuration and size, and if it means jumping onto an opportunity like this where COVID for the moment is impacting our student arrival numbers, but won't always. Yeah, from a counterintuitive point of view, it could be a good move, but I'd be very, very wary of going for something that doesn't have a good floor plan, and you don't want to be stuck being holding one of these things that remains in Mike's chart.
Yes, and I think it is a little bit specky, and we're going to talk about specky when it comes to Collinsville in a second. But I want to see if we've got Michael Ossett still on the line, because Palm Beach has shown up in fourth place. And for anyone that doesn't know where that is, it's the very sort of tip of the northern beaches of Sydney. I've only been there a couple of times. We've done some work for CEOs with little weekenders with views of the harbour there and the beach. Last time I was there, I had to pull over to the side to let a Ferrari California past. I think that's a fairly good idea of what's going on there. But yeah, Michael, I'm interested to see if you've got any comments on why there is such a vacancy and such a loss for landlords there. I guess it's an Airbnb style destination, and with domestic travel sort of hamstrung a little bit. That could be part of it. Michael sort of said some big expensive holiday houses sat empty, and yeah,
that'll do it. Yeah. If your weekly rental's 10 grand and you've got a couple of vacancy periods there, that will skew your data in terms of the magnitude of the loss.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, many of these properties, and Michael, let us know, but I'm assuming we're talking thousands and thousands of dollars for a weekend for your average property there. Michael's a high flyer. I'm sure he indulges in a little bit of that. But it sort of begs the question about Airbnb as an investment at the moment, and these holiday style accommodation places. Places like the Mornington Peninsula are pretty famous for that. What are we sort of seeing with those sorts of styles of properties, Kate?
Well, Melbourne was really hard hit with extended lockdown, and some of the scars are run deep. But a lot of people did decide to buy investment properties that were coastal, and with the view that they would double up their use. And so that naturally means that you've got to revert to things like Airbnb. $10,000 a night, not unheard of. Michael Ossett, my goodness, that's huge.
Wow. If you are going to rent that for the weekend, give your old mate like a call, I'll swing by. I mean, that's heavy hitting.
That is, it's big. So yeah, back to Melburnians making the move. A lot of the Melburnians that did buy coastal and tree change did so because they wanted to get out of Melbourne and have somewhere themselves to live. And if they were able to do that and hold a Melbourne property, then they're finding themselves with a fully furnished property that can be put onto Airbnb or a similar platform. But if they sold their property or they were renting and they ended up moving out to permanently be in the country, then that won't contribute to this data at all, Mike. So we've seen a lot of people use every single ounce of their borrowing capacity and equity position and make the move and dedicate themselves to tree change, sea change. My concern is that won't suit everyone long term. So we'll see some that will make it work and love it, and we'll see some that will miss the city and miss the amenity and need to move back for whatever reason. It might be, kids, jobs, whatever. So it's the commute and the long distance thing. It doesn't work for everyone. I chatted to someone a while ago who managed to move to Bright and loved it while they were able to work from home. As soon as the employers are saying, we want you back in the office, well, Bright to Melbourne it's a really unpleasant distance to have to commute under duress. So I think that, our regions have outperformed, but our coastal markets and our holiday style destinations that sounded really good during COVID, they've gone nuts. And I do wonder what the future growth prospects are like for those, because some of them are absolutely overheated. There's no doubt about it.
And the great sort of experiment of, are we all going to live in these sea change, tree change, regional locations, or post-COVID come back into the city? This is a big question. There's a lot of commentators that are saying this has changed everything forever. The regions are going to be where it's at. Everyone's going to move to places like Orange, although I saw a picture the other day and it was snowing, and so you can count that out for me. What's your sort of stance on that, and when will we actually really see, like, what have the conditions got to be like for us to go, all right, well, actually, like, that didn't really work. Most people have got to come back into the office because they miss the community of their colleagues, or their boss doesn't trust them to work remotely. When are we going to sort of know what the answer is, do you think?
I think that when Melbourne stops going into lockdown, when the snap lockdown thing eases, so vaccinations are rolled out, we get a grip on this virus, that's when we'll see things settle down. While there's still a high chance that you'll need to pack up your laptop and set up at the kitchen bench, I don't think that the appeal will wear off for the regional, sea change, tree change kind of lifestyle, because it's not pleasant when you're having to adjust, pivot really quickly and then be in a Melbourne lockdown. When we do have a consistent run, and we just started to see it before this lockdown just recently, we were seeing bosses saying, no, we want you all back in the office, or we want you on these days. And while we've seen the hybrid adopted by a lot of businesses, it hasn't been across the board. And for anyone who was starting to miss, the bands playing live in the city and great places to dine and friends easily catching up with you and the commute to work not being hours, they were starting to question the move and plan to move back. And I actually saw that reflected in my inquiry. So in September, October, 60% of my buyer inquiry was for moving out of the city and going into the regions. Right. And that started to ease. And then this year it was a dramatic easing. They were almost back to the normal 5 to 10% query that I get about moving out. And then I started to see a subtle shift with buyers saying, I did want to buy $1 million home in the Macedon Ranges, but now we'd prefer to have a little unit in Daylesford and keep our base here in Melbourne. So that willingness to hold on to Melbourne got stronger and stronger. And I think, that's a demonstration of the elasticity of the decisions that we make and the preferences that we have at the time when things feel horrible.
Yeah, and I guess we react to the stimulus, which leads to my next question. But before I do that, a big hello to Jay Anderson, who's jumped on the comments. He's a BA to the stars as well, Sydney-based chappie. And Marty's shared some great points and sort of echoes your sentiments as well. His points typically are too big to fit on the screen because he's excited. But big shout out to Marty as well. It's his birthday today, so love your work, Marty. If you've got a question for Cate, chuck it up. We'll close this off soon. I wanted to ask you the question because you've had the lockdown and then the release. I'm just interested what happens next. So as at midnight, what was it yesterday? You can sort of go outside. You've got to wear a mask indoors, outdoors. You still can't really sort of transact properly. But once things open up, do we see a flood of listings? Is there going to be a huge supply?
Yeah.
Like, what are vendors doing and thinking right now? Give us your crystal ball.
While we've been chatting, my text feed has been going off. I've turned everything on silent, but it's just been this constant data feed because we're almost 48 hours from the announcement that we were reopening, and Consumer Affairs still don't know whether we're allowed to do open for inspections or whether they have to be privately scheduled, non-advertised inspections. And we've been asking now this is our second day, we still don't know. And things on the internet could change quickly today. So the issue that we have is we still don't know what we're allowed to do. And I think that's a bit of a failing on the part of Consumer Affairs because we need that guidance when announcements are made. Yes. And we've got vendors and agents spinning their wheels, asking lots of questions and wondering whether they're listing their properties now or whether they're waiting until it's eased again so that they can advertise opens. And bear in mind, a campaign in Melbourne for an auction is typically 4 weeks, give or take. So 3 to 5 weeks is standard. And vendors want to absolutely make the most of those weekends and the midweek inspection times. And they want to make the most of their advertising dollars on the search engines as well, because when you list your property, it's priority or it stays up the top, and as the weeks go by, it drifts down to page number 5. So we've got a lot of vendors who are not wanting to list their properties until they know that A, we're out of the woods and they can have a normal campaign that won't be interrupted, and also B, they aren't wasting their dollars now on something that by the time restrictions are properly lifted, they're down on page 5. So at the moment, we don't have a glut of new listings at all, and that's been exacerbated by all of the listings that were falling over the last 3-week period were pretty much brought forward. I'd say 95% of those listings, agents said, right, let's get this sold. And so we had all of these Thursday night auctions 2.5 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago. We also had a lot brought forward and quickly zoomed via auction within a few days. So when we first went into lockdown, I was flat out, and we're all, on the chat, on email, on the phone, working remotely and facilitating auction bidding out of my living room. So we cleared a lot of stock, and the point is we've got very low listing numbers now, and we've got vendors sitting tight waiting. And we're also going into winter. It's really cold, and every single year we have this issue. Less people list their house in winter in Melbourne because there's a school of thought out there that you're better off waiting until spring when the sun's out, the gardens are looking great, the footy's over. That's when we tend to have our spring campaign kick into gear, usually October, November, December. They're really huge months. So combine that with the fact that we cleared all of our winter stock early because of COVID lockdown and a bit of vendor panic. And we've got all of this doubt around how we can actually facilitate campaigns. So vendors are sitting tight now. It's going to be difficult for buyers when the gates open and they can get out and have a look at properties and purchase, which has essentially started today. We just don't know how we're allowed to see properties because it's still not clear. But there'll be people seeing properties today and tomorrow, me included, and we'll be able to purchase. But with a greater number of purchases per property than normal, because we've got such a supply deficit, I believe that we'll see prices pushed up pretty aggressively. The supply and demand equation will be really stretched.
And It begs the question, when are we going to see the easing on that? Marty, the birthday boy, has asked, what impact will the lockdowns have on that annual spring listing season, I suppose? And what have we got? Given finance could be a little slow, should be getting our finance ready for spring now. Yeah, I think if you're wanting to buy, the first step is dealing with the banks, because there's often a month or two wait to get approval.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So these vendors, they obviously don't want to list their property unless they know they're going to get a good result. Listing, say, as soon as people can get out and inspect properties, is probably advantageous because there is such a shortage. Do you think we're still going to see that super strong market in Melbourne in the spring selling season if the listings do come?
Yeah, I want to say that we will, and the COVID breakouts have an enormous impact on this because we've got a state minister that will a premier that will pull us into lockdown pretty quickly, and we can't facilitate real estate transactions when that's the case. It's, you limp along, and those who have seen it and have the finance in place and are happy buying it on Zoom auctions, they're the ones that purchase. But we should have a really good spring if we don't have lockdowns.
Yeah.
And to Marty's point, having your finance in order so that you can make a fast decision, you have to be prepared for the property that you thought you had 3 weeks to get ready for. You need to be prepared for it to sell tomorrow when announcements are made, because that's the kind of frenzy we deal with. We've got vendors and agents who have to quickly get the deal done before the doors are locked, and you'll see a lot of immediate transactions when there's a public announcement about lockdown.
Yeah, and here's hoping that comes very soon for you all down there in Melbourne. It's been a hell ride, and it just seems disproportionately unfair for Melburnians and Victorians that have had to suffer these lockdowns. So our thoughts are with you there. Cate, I'm going to let you get to that crazy thread of SMS messages, because obviously as REBA president, and Michael's given you a big shout out for the amazing job you're doing there. You're going to have a lot of people, both buyers agent and real estate agents, saying, what on earth is going on? What can we do? So thank you very much for the time. I really appreciate it, and especially those data insights around those university precincts, and of course how to interpret this core logic stuff when we don't have a really perfectly normally transacting market.
Yeah, it's a really good point on that particular point, Mike, and thanks for having me on the show. I think it's really important that we understand how dated some of our results are to come in. And when I say that, it's recorded sometimes by the agents, but often when it settles. And in markets like this, we're seeing a lot of very nervous buyers and sellers opting for very long and flexible settlements. And that will always be the case when you've got a nervous market that might need longer, for example, COVID lockdowns. And so you'll see a lot of people who are purchasing and know that when they purchase, it triggers the need to sell, because if they're upgrading, they might not be in a position to hold 2 properties, and they might not be able to get bridging finance. And so they will often say to the real estate agent, can I have a 120 or a 150 day settlement with the option to bring it back once I've sold my property? That way I know I can settle on the same day. And so we've seen a propensity for much longer settlement periods through all of this, enormously longer. I've even seen 6-month settlements. And so what that means is the data that's getting recorded on settlement isn't necessarily reflecting 60 and 70 day settlement averages. It's sometimes reflecting much longer. So our lag is bigger.
That's a really, really interesting point, and there's a lot of data that we will see in 3 to 6 months' time that tells the real story about today. So anyone that's kind of looking at Melbourne and making a decision based on those Valuer General's figures, or the SDRO, you sort of really need to understand the nuances of that, and you've sort of helped to explain that to us today eloquently. So thank you very much. It's always a pleasure, and I hope you get some good news down there in the next couple of days.
Oh, me too, Mike. Thanks for having me on the show. And I told you I wouldn't swear, so there we go. We've nailed it.
Cheers. Thanks, Cate. See you next time.
See you later.